been a lot of tension on college campuses across our country as groups of students came together to express, well, their different opinions. Some were backing Israel, others backing Palestinians during this conflict that broke out after the terrorist attack by Hamas last Saturday morning. Now, on Thursday, students for what they say is justice in Palestine announced what they were calling a day of resistance. They were urging different campus chapters to organize rallies in support of Palestinian freedom. Columbia University, in fact, closed its campus to the entire public in anticipation of dueling protests, and other colleges had to reschedule activities. And well, if you're sending your kid to Harvard, maybe you're concerned if they signed a letter blaming Israel for these attacks, because now some CEOs say those students ought to be blacklisted for future employment. And it's coming from some pretty big heavy hitters. Mike Carter joins us now live with the latest on this. Obviously, Harvard got a lot of backlash and didn't even respond for days, Mike. It was silence there. You had a lot of folks waiting to say, why aren't you coming out?
That's right. In the subsequent days, Bianca, the president of Harvard has come out with a statement. We'll get to that in a moment. But increased security throughout Boston and Cambridge. That's where Harvard is today, as you can imagine, with what Hamas has called for. We're outside Temple, Israel right now, just across the river, the Charles River from Harvard. And you can see increased security waiting just outside the doors here at Temple, Israel. Increased security throughout temples and synagogues here in Boston and metro areas all across this area and all across the country, really. As you mentioned, Bianca, earlier this week, more than 30 Harvard student organizations put out a joint statement in support of Palestine solidarity. They're saying that Israel is to blame for Hamas's attacks. Well, those student groups protesting here in Harvard earlier this week, claiming, among other things, that the Israeli government has forced Palestinians to live in an open-air prison for over 2 decades. Many of those students in those organizations that condemned Israel also had their names and faces displayed on billboard trucks, which drove around Harvard Square this week in an apparent attempt to dox those students in those 31 organizations that have come out and blaming Israel. The doxing also being called for by billionaire hedge fund CEO Bill Ackman and several other business leaders who are calling for Harvard to release the names of those students in those organizations. The CEOs, they want those students blacklisted. Meanwhile, one of Harvard's Jewish organizations, Harvard Hillel, condemning that action, saying this week Harvard Hillel strongly condemns any attempts to threaten and intimidate co-signatories of the Palestine Solidarity Committee statement, including the bus on campus that displayed the names and faces of students affiliated with those groups who have signed it. Here's what Harvard's president, Claudine Gay, had to say this week about all of this.
Let me be clear. Our university rejects terrorism. That includes the barbaric atrocities perpetrated by Hamas. Our university rejects hate. Hate of Jews, hate of Muslims, hate of any group of people based on their faith, their national origin, or any aspect of their identity. Our university rejects the harassment or intimidation of individuals based on their beliefs. And our university embraces a commitment to free expression. That commitment extends even to views that many of us find objectionable, even outrageous.
And yesterday, Bianca, while signing up for the New Hampshire primary, Governor Ron DeSantis, he gave it his answer on his thoughts on what's been happening all across the nation, including Harvard, a place where he's an alumnus of. He went to Harvard Law School.
To see schools like Harvard have all these students signing these declarations in support of Hamas, you know, that's a real sickness in this society. And I think we've got to start taking a look, okay, you know, what are we supposed to do? Yeah, you can have different views. Of course you can. But what would prompt somebody to go out and support an organization that was beheading infants, that was raping women, that was assassinating elderly people?
All right, so an increased security presence at temples and synagogues here in Boston today, as you can see. So far, though, it's been quiet both at Harvard and across the Boston area. Bianca, hopefully it stays that way.
Hopefully. Also, I grew up in Boston, and 9/11, that is where 2 of the planes also took off. And They know how to do security now, and I know exactly where you are, Mike. I'm glad to see it is quiet and safe there. Appreciate it, and good to see you as always.
You got it. You too.
Let's talk about some of the college campus protests and what's going on. Siraj Hashmi, co-host of Habibi Brothers podcast, joins us. And also today we have Greg Price, independent journalist, to talk about some of the situation we're seeing here. Guys, welcome in. Good to have you both.
Good to see you, Bianca.
It's hard to believe, young kids are actually, I mean, obviously maybe they're not as well read in, right? And with what they need to know their history, but to have an Honor Your Martyr Day in, San Diego, UCSD, Greg, I mean, it seems like that just should be like 101. Why would people be showing up to celebrate the atrocities we saw here in Israel?
I mean, it's one of two things. Either they're fully aware that they're cheering on the mass murder of Jews in a terrorist organization that explicitly calls for the destruction of the Jewish state and the murder of Jews, in which case you're an evil piece of crap, or they're just not informed about what they're supporting, which is arguably worse, because in the last week, the ignorance, especially among college students, of Israel and the history of Israel and the facts on the ground is truly a sight to behold. They say things like Israel stole land from the Palestinians. Never mind the fact that there's never been a Palestinian state. You can go to Jerusalem and visit the city of David, which predates the founding of Islam as a religion. They say things like Israel are occupiers. Never mind the fact Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005, after which they elected Hamas. They say Israel's an apartheid state. Never mind the fact that after they retook the Temple Mount in the Six-Day War, they voluntarily gave it back to the
Right.
Find the fact that 20% of their population is Muslim. The ignorance of these people is astounding.
And it's on full display. And, part of this, too, I think is, we haven't seen any celebrities really coming out as strong. They've been really milquetoast on this all week. You had some deleting posts, rephrasing posts, Siraj, and also BLM put out the how they stand with Palestine. A lot of this could be groupthink as well. And, if those Harvard kids now are reassessing what they signed, is there, I don't know how they, and this right here, this is real. This was not a mistake. This was BLM Chicago. We had Starbucks Union saying we stand with Palestine. So these are corporate places like Starbucks and also obviously Marxists like BLM. And kids are seeing this.
Yeah, it's part of the propaganda arm in which they want to destroy Jews and the state of Israel. And I think it's important to know that this indoctrination goes well beyond just college campuses. Children aren't taught to hate. They innately are born and they love everything. They don't see any differences. This is being taught to them directly. And you really have to go to the source of all of this. While they talk actually about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez mentions this whole idea of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. Well, if we're really going to talk about ethnic cleansing, there is a worldwide effort to ethnically cleanse the Jews, and it's been that way in the 5,000 plus years that Jews have been on this earth.
Really glad we're having this conversation, and it needs to be more and more, obviously, because what's happening across college campuses, and like you said, even further, Siraj, is a disturbing trend for sure. Siraj, Greg, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate your analysis.